I'm Elliot Chodoff, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered, your go-to podcast for in-depth analysis on the complex and dynamic conflicts shaping the Middle East, Israel, and the world. Join us as we delve into the latest developments, historical contexts, and the geopolitical forces at play. We bring you the insights you need to understand the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay engaged, and uncover the truths behind the headlines. Hi, and welcome to Conflict Uncovered. It's April 7th, 3:15 in the afternoon here in Israel, and I'm joined again by my good friend Zev Uslan. We'll be having a conversation today about a little bit more sociological issues than strategic, but relevant to what's going on today in the Middle East and in the world. Zev, good to have you back.
It's nice to be back, Elliot, 2 hours away from you here in southern Jerusalem. So I have a lot of contact with friends, colleagues, family in the United States. And what they keep on raising is a very important question that I'm hoping we can discuss, which is we don't understand how there are 7 fronts. There are 3 fronts. There are, and we don't like saying this, Zev, but Muslims, and we understand the right term is radical Muslims or Islamists, but we don't understand the whole idea of they want to kill Jews. We can't understand that. We can't understand this Hamas killing people, and we get the news that says you are doing the killing. We don't understand the Houthis. We don't understand Hezbollah. And now, certainly, we don't understand the Iranians and how much they all want to kill you. And we read sometimes they want to kill us. What's this thing about killing? And so that's what I'd like to talk about today, Elliot. Killing.
Okay, always having an uplifting conversation with you, Zev. Let me try to break it down a little bit, and then let's bat it back and forth. First of all, you mentioned something that I just want to throw out there and not discuss now, and that's the divergence between the reporting and what's happening. And that's, I think, a whole subject in and of itself. But the idea that there is a value system culture that wants to wipe us out, that sees killing as an acceptable method, not as an extreme, not as a last alternative, but as a first step. And yes, I refer to it as radical Islamists, not Muslims, because Muslim is far too general a term and not specific enough for what we're talking about. So I want to enter the subject or the discussion with 3 points, and in no particular order. First of all, we've seen this before. We saw it with the Nazis, and I know every time you invoke the Nazi Germany, you're going out somewhere on a limb. And here it's relevant for 2 reasons. One, because it happened already. In other words, we've already seen this phenomenon less than a century ago. We're not talking about ancient times or medieval times, but mid-20th century. It's relevant also because much of the ideology of radical Islam comes out of Nazism. So that's topic number 1. In other words, the Nazi as a model. Second, I think there's a psychological issue here of it's hard to internalize that people simply want you dead. It's in some ways, and I think this is more your field than mine in terms of psychology, but I'll put my 2 cents in. There's something very disempowering about the idea that people want to kill you because of who you are, rather than because of what you've done or are doing. Because if it's about what you've done or are doing, you can change your ways and change their attitude. If it's simply because you exist, and as my friend Professor David Patterson puts it, for Jews in Nazi Germany, being alive was a capital offense. There's something, again, psychologically disempowering, because there is nothing I can do to change this, built into that thought, and that's very difficult. Again, and psychologically absorbing that and integrating. The third point, which is also, I think, part of the shock, is that what we're seeing now blatantly, which was denied in the West and the United States by much of the population for decades, is a culture that defies, that rejects blatantly and graphically Western liberal secular humanism. And just a couple of points on what I mean by that. Secular humanism, coming out of the Enlightenment, posits, first of all, the human being is fundamentally good. And people who do not behave well are an aberration. It's a phenomenon that needs to be explained. Something went wrong, which is why American prison systems are called correctional systems. People need to be fixed. There's no such thing as a bad boy.
It's
Boys Town, the movie Boys
a
Town.
misunderstood boy.
They're misunderstood. They had a deprived childhood. Something went wrong that took this otherwise good human being and made them behave badly. We don't even call them bad. We call them good people misbehaving. And an entire culture that is built on the idea of killing flies in the face of that. That's number one. Number two, yes.
Let me intercede briefly. I'm trying to understand this, and so I'm reading a book called Why They Kill. It's a book about the eminent criminologist Lonnie Athens, where he outlines and flies in the face of exactly what you're saying, agreeing with you, that they make a choice to kill. These people are choosing.
Absolutely.
This is a criminologist, so it's not related to the cultural, societal issues. But I'm trying to look at it to understand, thinking about how these cultures train people to kill and emulate that. So it relates.
In contrast, just to digress for a moment, in contrast, there's a book by a West Point professor psychologist named Dave Grossman called On Killing, where he looks at American society and talks about what is involved in teaching soldiers to kill. In other words, how it creates dissonance with cultural values. Okay, so we're seeing two different aspects of it. But here, I want to come back to the liberal secular humanism idea that, among other things, it's argued, A, that the human being is a rational animal, which is disputed in all sorts of literature I won't go into here. But as rational animals, it means that we all will come to the same conclusion, and leading away from that or out of that is that we are all fundamentally alike. And because rationality would argue that if I come to a rational conclusion, you must come to the same rational conclusion, because it's almost mathematical. And here we have the reality that they don't think that way for whatever reason. I've had many discussions with people who start with, well, if I were them, and I stop them at that point, you're not them. And they said, but they're like us. And no, they're not. And I want to conclude, sort of going completely far afield, just to emphasize the point. The value of life is not a universal value. And I think that I find it interesting that people in the United States, many people, not all, certainly, are so divorced from the roots of their values that they don't understand that value of life is not universal, but rather comes out of Jewish values and what we would call today Judeo-Christian, but I think, to be fair, inherited from the Torah. And it's become so ingrained, so second nature, so for granted that it's believed that it's universal. So I want to take a case, and I'll end this part of it with take a case that's completely unrelated to what we're talking about in terms of Islam and radical Islamism and current events. And let's go to traditional Japan of 400 years ago. And the value of life in traditional Japan is extremely low. The solution to everything is kill, including yourself.
Right. Harry Carey.
And, okay. And if you've ever read Shogun, it's sort of the core there is that the Western are trying to understand Japanese thinking, and of course the other way around as well, but can't get through his head that killing as a culture is functional in that society. I'm not judging right or wrong here. We can judge, but that society operates that way. Value of life is extremely low, and the system operated that way for hundreds of years, and saw nothing wrong with it. That was the value. So just to recap, value of life is not universal. Value of your own life is not universal. Value of others' life is not universal. So we're looking at a culture society that sees death and killing as a perfectly reasonable first resort to solving a problem. And look, practically speaking, it's hard to argue against that. Morally, it's something else, but practically, if I kill my enemy, I don't have to worry about him anymore.
Just one slight deviation. In terms of Americans, it's ironic because America is a nation of immigrants. My grandparents, I'm sure yours, fled the Ukraine, and Russia, and Belarus because of pogroms at the early last century. And many stories like that, they were fleeing horrific murderers.
Yes.
The melting pot and the values, of which I fully agree with, of sanctity of life, at this point has come to bite America in the butt, it seems like, because then we can't understand death cultures that you're talking about. And it's a tremendous distance between that reality and how Americans think about the rest of the world. Just wanted to make that comment, personalize it.
I agree with you 100%. I think that your point, the message has been lost over the generations. American Jews, and this is a different discussion, I think Americans in general, but American Jews in particular, have consciously, willfully, and understandably moved away from the idea of being persecuted and murdered. And for a variety of reasons, including where I started from, it's really not nice to think that there are people out there who want to kill me simply because of who I am and what I am. And America, up until very recently, another discussion perhaps for the future, made it socially unacceptable to even discuss the idea of annihilating the Jews or anybody else for that matter. And I don't want to get into the African-American experience as horrific as it was. But it's easy to fall behind that and convince yourself that I live in safety and nobody wants to come after me because I am basically a good person. And why on earth would they want to?
Therefore, it's difficult to comprehend the situation that Israel is in with countries that want to kill us simply because we exist. It's beyond rational, ironically, comprehension.
Yes. Well, they say it not, most of them say it about the Jews in general, but they practice it. I mean, Hezbollah is blowing up the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, for example, and of course some of the attacks we're seeing today around the world against Jews by association, as if are being attacked because of Israel's behavior in Gaza or some such other excuse. There's always an excuse. I think they're shocked by it. There is enormous cognitive dissonance, and that is creating this shock of, I can't understand the what and the why. And I think that some of it is leading also to, by them, criticism of Israel, and not that Israel can't be criticized. As you know, Israelis are the best at criticizing our government, but criticism of Israeli action beyond reality, the genocide libel, for example, because that gives them the ability to say it's happening because of them. This again, there's something empowering in saying, okay, I understand why they're trying to do this to me. And I can blame it on someone, even if it's blaming it on Israel. If Israel would only stop doing what it's doing, then I'd be okay.
I think,
yeah.
I think, look, I'm an American, Israeli American, and I don't think most Americans like thinking in complex, confused terms. I don't understand what's going on type of thinking. I think as Jews, we're quite used to that. It's like, I don't know, let's argue about it. But I think Americans, it's this or that. And I think it makes the complexity of this, which I think we see as simple, but to understand that, to get to a point of simplicity, I think it's very difficult for American/Western thinking, which believes there has to be happiness and time and history gets better. And here it's not getting better. And there has to be a reason for it. Apparently, it must be the Israelis.
I agree. Well, first of all, the difficulty in complexity has to do in part with the roots of Greco-Roman thinking, Hellenistic thinking, in which there can only be one right answer, and you reason your way to it, and that comes back to the rationality. Everybody comes to the same right answer. Where, as we know, in Jewish thought, there may not be a right answer. We may argue over it for forever, and in the end say, we'll wait till Elijah shows up and he'll give us the answer, meaning, forget about it. And we live with it. And we live with the uncertainty. We live with the lack of clarity. That's part of Jewish intellectual culture. It's Talmudic thinking. It's rabbinical thinking. And it goes back. It goes back to contradictions in the Torah, in the Tanakh, that the West has a hard time with because Western thinking comes out of Greco-Roman. The other point to it reminds me of something that goes back to the 1980s. If we criticize Israel, we might be able to have an impact because we have influence over Israel. Criticizing Hamas does us no good because they're not going to listen to us anyway. Criticizing Iran does us no good because they're not going to listen to us anyway. And just very, very briefly, there's a classic episode of the show Nightline. I don't know if you remember Ted Koppel back in the day.
Yes, I do, yeah.
Okay, to make a very long, well, it wasn't very long, but to make a long story short, Israel, this is the summer of 1981, Israel had bombed the PLO headquarters in Beirut after destroying the Iraqi nuclear reactor in Baghdad, and America decides to embargo arms to Israel as a result. And Ted Koppel has Al Haig, who was then Secretary of State, on, and he says, Mr. Secretary, aren't we only punishing one side by embargoing arms to Israel? And Haig zigs and zags. He says, well, we only sell arms to Israel. We don't sell arms to the PLO. So the only way we can influence things is by cutting off arms to Israel. And Koppel just doesn't let him go. He asks him like 3 different times, yes, I understand, Mr. Secretary. Aren't we only punishing one side by embargoing arms to Israel? And finally, Haig says, yes, Ted, we are only punishing one side by cutting off the arms to Israel. And I think we can carry that forward to, as I said before, criticizing Israel, pressuring Israel socially, wise, and whatever, what the Biden administration tried to do, to a certain extent succeeded through military withholding, what Europe has done in terms of embargo, is to try to pressure the side that it can pressure, because it has very little influence over the other side. And that's part of the empowerment. I think part of Trump's frustration.
If I were listening to this podcast, I would have a greater understanding of our Western conundrum. But is there some way of shortly, succinctly understanding radical Islamists? Because that's a different conversation entirely.
Yes, it's a different conversation. I'll see if I can introduce it quickly here. Today, virtually all radical Islamists, I say virtually because there's never 100% in social construction, draw their ideology from the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, from the ideology of the Brotherhood. I want to be clear. It doesn't mean that they are branches of the Brotherhood. Some of them are like Hamas, but others are simply the ideological descendants of the Brotherhood's ideology, most specifically embodied in the works of Sayyid Qutb, who was the primary ideologue of the Brotherhood until Nasser hanged him in the mid-1960s. Qutb was first and foremost a Muslim theologian, and second, he was a Nazi. He was a blatant, open, admitted, proud follower of Hitler's ideology. And as a matter of fact, he wrote a piece in the early 60s called Our Struggle with the Jews. And of course, he chooses words carefully. He calls it Our Struggle, which is the plural of Mein Kampf.
Right.
Okay. There's an excellent book on him and others. I mentioned my friend Professor David Patterson before. He wrote a book about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, called A Genealogy of Evil, From Nazi Ideology to Islamic Jihad. He shows the connection. But if you understand that we're taking a radical religious ideology and fusing it with Nazi ideology, largely having to do with the Jews, but not exclusively. In other words, Qutb is a Nazi. He's not just an anti-Semite Nazi. And his writings have enormous influence on Ayatollah Khomeini in the 60s, enormous influence on Brotherhood-based groups that include Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Erdogan of Turkey. Hamas, as I mentioned, is a branch of the Brotherhood. So we see the spread of this ideology, and here also I want to be explicit, across the Sunni-Shiite divide. Khomeini was a Shiite, and he was a disciple of Qutb, who was a Sunni. And we see the elements of Qutb's writings, and I use him as an example. There were a few others, Maududi, for example, but Qutb is kind of the core. And they're developed from there. In other words, they take it further. And we see the idea of killing as a method. Haj Amin al-Husseini, another Brotherhood character who raised 2 SS divisions. There were 2 Muslim SS divisions in World War II. His exhortation to them was, kill the Jews wherever you may find them. This is pleasing to Allah. the short answer is it's not a cult. It's a value system. Cult implies something sort of fringe, external. This is a core value system. We have Iran that was established on the principles of Khomeini, who wrote his principles in part on the ideology of Qutb. We see it with Al-Qaeda. We saw it with ISIS and their slaughter, not of Jews. They would have, but they didn't have the opportunity. That death is the solution. And the fact that the declared enemies of Islam under Qutb were the United States of America. Qutb lived in America in the early 1950s, and he left horrified by the decadence of American society. And it was he who put the frame that America is a great Satan into the thought of radical Islam. Khomeini expressed it, but it's Qutb who creates the underpinnings of it. And of course, the Jews are the Jews are the Jews are the Jews. The Jews are the enemy. They've always been the enemy. They're the enemy of all good. All evil in the world comes from the Jews. And therefore, annihilating the Jews is a value. It's a good thing. It's, and again, this comes out of Nazism. The minute you define your enemy, the Jew, as vermin, as pestilence, and today we hear from the Iranians as cancer, wiping the Jews out becomes not an unfortunate necessity, but a value necessity. How could you not wipe out cancer if you have the opportunity? And this is the frame that they're operating on.
Elliot, I have so many questions. I think we're running out of time. But future, I would like to discuss multiple doctoral dissertations like why the Jews, and B, why did this find such a home in Islam?
Okay.
What was the fertile ground, the agar, that allowed it to prosper? My understanding of history is that Islam was, Jews and Christians were second-class demis. They were second-class.
Correct.
And somehow I wonder if this doesn't fit in to be discussed in the future.
It does. As a matter of fact, maybe I'll see if I can bring David Patterson in, and we'll have a three-way discussion with him, because he's really one of the world's experts on it. But I will say this, that one of the debates that I had with him for many, many years until I finally brought him around to it is that the Islamic radicalism actually violates some of the fundamental principles of Islam, like the idea of the dhimma. In other words, that in classical Islam, that Jews and Christians were protected second-class citizens, but the key word protected. Radical Islam has abandoned that. And in that, it's actually become a negative reform movement rather than a fundamentalist movement. But that's a discussion that we'll leave for another time.
Elliot, thank you. As always, our conversations are rich and stimulating and keep me up at night with excitement and deep thoughts. Thanks a lot, Elliot.
Well, the sirens are what keep me up at night, but that's okay. Always glad to help. Zev, it's been a pleasure again, as usual. We'll do it again soon.
Good. Thank you.
And to our listeners, thanks for being with us. Stay safe, stay engaged. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to Conflict Uncovered. As always, it's been another rough day in the Middle East. We hope you found this episode insightful and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share and recommend with your friends, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. For more in-depth analysis and exclusive content, join our community and follow us on social media. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to explore the critical issues shaping the Middle East and the world. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.